Hello, everyone, and welcome to the March Live Patreon Q&A. This is Andreas Antonopoulos. Thank you all for participating in this event, and welcome to this, I think it's the fourth live Q&A. So let me quickly check in with the chat room and make sure everybody can see the video and hear the audio well. Give me a shout out on the chat room. Excellent. Everyone can see and hear me well, so let's jump right in. We've got 1 hour of Q&A, and thank you all for asking great questions. Over the past 4 weeks, we've been collecting questions at the live Patreon Q&A site, which is at antonopoulos.com, Patreon-live-Q&A. And we have so many questions. Thank you again for submitting your questions, but also thank you for voting and commenting and discussing and preparing a great event. So let me dive right in, and we'll start answering these questions. James asks, store value in a volatile market. My smart friend says that the biggest barrier to mass adoption is price volatility, which limits Bitcoin's use as a store of value. Its most convincing use case to date. It's a lousy store of value if the price keeps changing. Is this right? Are there other obstacles to mass adoption? What are they, in your opinion? James, your friend may be smart, but I don't think they understand some of the basic economics at play here. So first of all, I don't think price volatility really affects Bitcoin's use as a store of value. Store of value is definitely a long-term perspective. It certainly affects Bitcoin's use as a medium of exchange. But as a store of value, if you are buying and investing in Bitcoin and using it as a store of value, then you have a long-term perspective, certainly more than a year. How's Bitcoin doing in the last year? Oh, it's up about 600%. Sounds like a pretty good store of value to me. Over the last 3 years, definitely pretty good store of value. If you look at it over 3 months, it's probably not a good store of value. But that's not what store value means. Store value is definitely a long-term perspective. The other thing about this is that it's a bit of a circular argument, because volatility really is an expression of size. For example, in a follow-up question, James said, we tend to harbor an expectation that this volatility, a key obstacle to Bitcoin's wider success, will eventually calm down. But Bitcoin's resistance to regulation is a feature, not a bug. So where will the stability come from, absent of mass adoption and absent of regulation? I think there's a broad misunderstanding about how volatility is dealt with in capital markets and currency markets. The idea that regulators control volatility in a currency, I think, is an illusion. Regulation doesn't control volatility. If anything, regulated markets that don't have enough flexibility and liquidity are more volatile. I would say the biggest contributor to volatility is the small size of a currency. And you've got to understand that Bitcoin is currently traded on a global basis. Unlike most other national currencies that have primarily domestic markets, Bitcoin is a global market. And for a global market, it's tiny. It really is absolutely tiny. $100 billion is nothing in currencies, even for a currency that's only domestic, let alone for a currency that's traded globally. So this kind of sounds like a circular argument. It's basically saying the biggest barrier to mass adoption is the lack of mass adoption. And if only there was more mass adoption, then there'd be more mass adoption. The biggest barrier to Bitcoin being big is that Bitcoin is small. And if only Bitcoin was bigger, then it could be bigger. Because that's what price volatility is. It's that this currency is small. And so if the fact that it's small is a barrier to it becoming big, that's kind of circular logic. As Bitcoin gets bigger, volatility goes down. As the market becomes more liquid, as it is traded more and used for different purposes and not just speculation, I think that reduces volatility. The more companies depend on Bitcoin as an input, or use it for payments to contractors or providers, or hold inventory and purchase things based on Bitcoin, or sell things based on Bitcoin, the more the price volatility is reduced. Right now, it's mostly used for speculation. It's mostly dealt with as a short-term basis. It's traded globally in a wide open market, and as a result, it's quite volatile. So yes, Bitcoin will become less volatile as it grows, or at least I certainly hope it will. I think the economics would argue that. Okay, let me quickly check back in with the chat room, see if everybody's doing good. All right. Let's try to avoid adding questions at this point. I'm watching the chat room, but I'm not going to be answering questions that haven't already been submitted in the Q&A. That's what the forum is for, so that you can submit your questions in advance, discuss them with everybody else, and get answers during the live Q&A. So I would encourage you to ask your questions in advance. Showing up at the live session and asking questions is a bit late. Also, let's try not to distract with secondary conversations going on. But let's get back to the questions that you voted as the best questions for this month. Rodney asks, Ethereum presale, ICO or no? Do you consider the Ethereum presale an ICO? If so, why? If not, why not? This topic has been hot recently due to SEC announcements about ICOs being securities. I'm curious to hear Andreas' thoughts on this situation too. Is the follow-up comment to that question. So I think Ethereum probably has one of the best arguments as to its role as a utility token rather than a security. Keep in mind, unlike many of the other fundraisers that have happened with various startups, Ethereum isn't really a startup. It's not a company. There is no company, and there are no shares or equity or registration. There's a foundation, but that foundation is a Swiss nonprofit, and you certainly don't get shares in that foundation or in future profits. Ethereum also has a specific role as a platform, and that platform has been the platform for all of the other ICOs. So the token, Ether, is a token that is meant to be used to pay for gas. That's the argument for Ethereum. The idea is that Ether is how you control the use of resources on the Ethereum platform for other applications, including ICOs. Ether pays for the network fees, the gas for running smart contracts, for doing transactions on the Ethereum platform. I think Ether as a utility token and Ethereum as a utility platform is probably a fairly well developed argument and a robust argument. I don't really see Ethereum's presale as an ICO. I think it is the most credible utility token out there in terms of it being utility rather than security. I'm not commenting on the value of it or its use as a currency or a speculative instrument. That's not my answer here. But simply comparing it between a security or utility token, I think the argument is quite robust for it being a utility token. Ash asks, do you believe there are cartels in the crypto space? There's lots of noise about Bitcoin being manipulated and such things. What do you think? I think the lady doth protest too much. What I would say is I wasn't hearing a lot of complaining about Bitcoin being manipulated when it increased 5, 6, 8, 100, 1,000% in 6 months. There wasn't much complaining about manipulation and pumping and all of that when the price was going up by a factor of 10. Now that the price is going down, for obvious reasons, anything that goes up 1,000% in 6 months is bound to have a correction. And I had started calling for a correction in October of last year and saying that these prices are unsustainable. And I got quite roundly bashed for that, for being a naysayer and a negative Nelly and all of that. But the point is that anything that goes up 1,000% is likely to have a correction at some point. If it goes up too fast, it's going to come down even faster. As they say in trading, what goes up on an escalator comes down on an elevator. And in this particular case, now we have a lot of people going on about how Bitcoin is being manipulated by whales, by the futures market, by world governments trying to dump crypto holdings in order to tank the market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth is that if you look at the broader market, it's not just Bitcoin. There's been a massive correction in tech stocks. There's been massive corrections in stock markets around the world. There have been massive corrections in currencies. And now there are also massive corrections happening in crypto. And this is, I think, a natural response to a market that got over exuberant with too much excitement. Too many people bought Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, not because they believed in or understood the value of the technology, not because they thought this technology was going to have a great potential for future returns, but they thought that they would get rich in a matter of months simply by buying into a fad. That is a greater fool theory. That is not a good basis to invest in. And so when people were asking me, Bitcoin $16,000, should I buy now? I honestly told people, your strategy should be based on dollar cost averaging and figuring out what you're comfortable with and understanding the technology. And the more you understand the technology, the more comfortable you should be about your investment decisions. And if you're asking me, and I'm not an investment advisor, then you shouldn't be buying this stuff. So yeah, I don't believe there are cartels in the crypto space. Do I believe there's manipulation? Sure, absolutely. Do I believe that there's various pump and dump schemes and whales trying to manipulate the price and completely irrational buying, completely irrational selling that's pushing the price around? Absolutely. All of that is happening. But that's not the reason that the price is crashing. And I think trying to find causation in these markets is a fool's game. It's like reading tea leaves or predicting stock prices based on the alignment of the zodiac. Next question. Let's see, what else do we have? Everybody having fun so far? Let me check in on the chat room. Very good. Excellent. Noah says, debunking the blockchain but not Bitcoin point of view. How do we persuade average Joes that the blockchain but not Bitcoin line of thinking is incorrect? Well, first of all, Noah, why waste your time? If they want to go and play the blockchain not Bitcoin game, let them go and play the blockchain not Bitcoin game. I don't think it's our job to persuade other people about the merits of this technology. If what they can understand about this technology is a slogan that has really played out itself since 2014, really, I don't think there's any point in trying to persuade people about the blockchain but not Bitcoin trope. I think it's a cliche. When somebody says, I believe in blockchain, but I'm not interested in Bitcoin, I think they're basically saying, I don't understand blockchain. I don't understand blockchain, but I've heard enough to think that I can sound cool by dismissing Bitcoin and praising blockchain because I've heard a lot of other people say that. It's kind of just repeating a cliche. So why does blockchain not work without Bitcoin? Or rather, why do blockchains not work without an intrinsic valuable asset that is the basis for a game theoretical model of security? And the reason is simple. A blockchain as a structure, a data structure, is a fairly inefficient data structure. And the reason we use a blockchain is to achieve decentralization. In order to achieve decentralization, you have to be able to validate transactions without giving anyone the power of veto or the power to control the network. You have to decentralize the process of validation. And the best mechanism we found so far for decentralizing the process of validation is by having a consensus algorithm that depends on competition, whether that's proof of work or proof of stake or something like that. In order to have competition, you need risk and reward. And in order to have a reward that's meaningful, you need an intrinsic token. You need something of value that people are trying to get, which keeps them playing fair. If you don't have something of value, then you don't have a basis for that competition. Without a basis for that competition, you don't have security. Without security, you have to control validation centrally, and without decentralization, there's no point to doing a blockchain. You might as well use a replicated database. It's going to be far, far more efficient. The purpose of blockchain technology and a consensus algorithm is to decentralize control, to provide censorship resistance, neutrality, and a global open platform. And in order to do those things, you need some mechanism to decentralize validation. Very good. Harry asks, if you're traveling the world and only accepting Bitcoin for payments, that seems to be a complicated tax situation. If I were to pursue the same path as you and accept only Bitcoin for my services, how would I handle paying taxes? All right, a few clarifications there, Harry. First of all, I do travel the world and I do accept Bitcoin as a payment, but I don't only accept Bitcoin as a payment. I accept payment in a number of currencies. I prefer cryptocurrencies for a variety of reasons, including the fact that when I get paid with cryptocurrencies, I get paid quickly, without the possibility of chargeback, without complications from banks, without having to call a bank 15 times to find out what happened to my Swift wire transfer and why it hasn't been approved yet. And only being able to operate Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 in whatever jurisdiction or time zone that bank is in. So for many reasons, I prefer cryptocurrencies, but I don't only accept cryptocurrencies. I accept US dollars and euros and yen. I accept British pound sterling, and I accept Bitcoin, and I accept Ether and Litecoin and Bitcoin Cash and, quite a variety of other currencies. So before I got into cryptocurrency, I also operated a consulting business that had international clients. And at that time, I also accepted British pound sterling and euros and US dollars for payments. So I already operated a multinational, multi-currency small business. And how do you operate a multinational, multi-currency small business? Well, generally speaking, it is much easier if you price your services in a single currency. For accounting reasons, that's preferably the currency that you're paying taxes in. So as a US resident, I pay taxes in the US. And so I price my services in US dollars because that's going to be the basis on which I calculate my cost, my income, and the tax that I owe. So if I charge someone, say, 100 US dollars for a service, then I'm going to price that as 100 US dollars. If they want to pay me in British pound sterling, euro, yen, or Bitcoin, they're going to have to, at the moment of payment, make a conversion and say, okay, I owe 100 US dollars to Andreas. How much is that in pound sterling right now when I'm paying? And they'll make that conversion and they'll make payment in whatever currency they choose to make, whether euro or Bitcoin or whatever, at the appropriate rate. when I receive this foreign currency or this cryptocurrency instead of US dollars, I have received 100 US dollars worth of value. That's how much I priced it. That's what the exchange rate was at the time. So I know that what I received was worth 100 US dollars at the time of payment. Now, that's income. So I have to pay income taxes on that. Income taxes on 100 US dollars. It doesn't matter what currency I got paid in. In fact, it doesn't even have to be currency. If I received my payment in cake, the IRS requires me to declare the value of that cake at the moment of payment. And when I eat it, I then have to remit 30%, 40% to the US government as federal income tax. And they don't take cake for income tax payment any more than they take British pound sterling, euro, or Bitcoin. So I have to give them the equivalent amount in US dollars. Now, the other complication, of course, which applies to foreign currencies is if I receive euro and I don't convert it to US dollars, or if I receive Bitcoin and I don't convert it to US dollars, and then later, 6 months later, I do convert it to another currency or use it to buy something. And in the meantime, the value of that currency, whether it be Bitcoin, euro, British pound sterling, has increased by 10%, I have to pay capital gains on that 10% increase. What is my cost basis? Well, my cost basis is the same as the amount of my invoice and the same as the amount of pricing I did back then. So the amount of euro or Bitcoin I received was 100 US dollars worth at that time. So if it's now worth 110 US dollars when I sell it, then I've made 10 US dollars worth of capital gains, and I need to pay either short-term or long-term capital gains rates on that gain. So really, it's not that difficult. Handling taxes is exactly the same as if I was handling taxes in any other currency, foreign currency. Exactly the same as operating a multinational, multi-currency business, whether you accept cryptocurrency or not. You still have to pay capital gains. And I had to pay capital gains on my euro income before cryptocurrencies came around too. And that's the more complicated side. So keeping track of cost basis, tracking the cost basis for every income I receive in a cryptocurrency or other currency. And then when I make a payment or a conversion or what they call a taxable event, I count my capital gains or capital losses, and I pay for that tax too. So that's basically it. It takes a lot of reporting. It takes a lot of paperwork. But it's not really complicated. It's just that you have to do your accounting carefully. And obviously, like any small business, I use an accountant to do that. And I used an accountant before cryptocurrencies came along because the US tax code is just crazy complicated. In fact, fun story, Intuit, the company that owns TurboTax, has been paying lobbyists for more than a decade now to lobby against any simplification of the tax code. Because the more complex it is, the more you need their products. So, it's not an accident that the tax code is very, very complex. So that's how you do taxes with cryptocurrencies. And keep in mind, I'm not an accountant, I'm not an attorney, I'm not a financial advisor, and I'm not a tax advisor. I'm simply telling you how I do it and what my personal experience as a small business entrepreneur is, and what advice my accountant gives me. Of course, in order to do this right, you have to take responsibility, and ultimately you should consult with a qualified professional to get advice on these issues. All right, let me quickly check in with the chat room, see everybody is doing okay. Pachelik, I believe I'm pronouncing this name correctly. Pachelic asks, Bitcoin will never add default privacy or fungibility, within quotes. Ari Paul believes that it's highly unlikely that Bitcoin adds default privacy or fungibility, and again within quotes, because this would likely tank the price, since it means that all institutional and regulation-conscious money will have to dump it. So apparently this is a quote from Ari Paul, and I don't know if this is an accurate quote or if it's paraphrased. So please take that with a pinch of salt. The question continues, there are many other reasons why people might not support a default privacy update as well. Realistically, do you think it's in any way plausible for the main chain to add default privacy, or will there almost inevitably be a separate cryptocurrency that provides the fungibility use case, whether it be the results of a contentious hard fork or a separate crypto such as Monero? Honestly, I disagree. And, you know, to me, Bitcoin has never been about the investment and use of institutional and regulation-conscious money. Institutional regulation-conscious money already has plenty of investment avenues and plenty of currencies to choose from. So if the addition of privacy and fungibility features actually did reduce the price of Bitcoin, I'm okay with that. To me, it's more important that this is a currency that is usable by the vast majority of human beings who do not have access to stable, reliable, and private currencies because they don't have access to stable, reliable, and democratic institutions or stable, reliable, and non-mafioso-run bankers. And so, quite honestly, I don't give a damn what institutional and regulation-conscious money does. And I certainly don't think the developers who are involved in implementing features, the cypherpunks of Bitcoin, really give a damn about what investment-conscious money does. So there will be additions of privacy and fungibility. They are very much on the roadmap. And if that causes regulation-conscious money and investment-conscious money to leave Bitcoin, well, that's a very good indication that those privacy and fungibility technologies are effective and working correctly. They're going to have to find some other kind of surveillance coin that they can pump and dump for a get-rich-quick scheme. Ripple sounds like a good idea. Maybe they could go to that one and let Bitcoin do the privacy things that it needs to do to serve the other 6 billion people who are not interested in playing this game of crony surveillance capitalism. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Mark asks, hardware wallet and a full node? I've been wanting to run a full node and ensure good security of my private keys. You recommend a hardware wallet as the most secure, user-friendly way of storing private keys, as the Glacier protocol or air-gapped private keys are more difficult to secure for new users. But Bitcoin Core does not support hardware wallets. And to set up Electrum as a full node requires maintaining an Electrum server or the Electrum personal server, which is very new and only maintained by one developer. What options are there to have your transactions validate through your own full node and sign with a hardware wallet that is relatively safe and easy? Well, Mark, that's a great question. And you are right. Bitcoin Core does not currently support the use of hardware wallets. However, just because you are using a full node to validate your own transactions doesn't mean that that full node has to sign them. So here's a setup that is much easier to do. Bitcoin Core does support BIP39 and BIP32 hierarchical deterministic wallets. So what you can do is you can initialize Bitcoin Core to have what's called a watch-only extended public key. And what that means is that Bitcoin Core has the public key and the addresses of your entire HD wallet, but doesn't have any of the private keys and cannot sign transactions. That allows you to use a full node to monitor your transactions, to monitor the value and the balance of your various accounts, and to independently verify payments made to you. And if you want to sign a transaction, you open another platform. A simple Electrum wallet will do. Or quite honestly, any of the other wallets that support hardware wallet backends, and you sign your transaction there. And then you go back to Bitcoin Core, and you verify that your transaction has been propagated, and you can see your balance update. Let's check again with the chat room, see if everybody's having fun. Lots of conversation going on. Harry asks, what are your thoughts on a Bitcoin proof-of-work change to combat mining centralization? Lately, we've had the anonymous owner of Bitcoin.org, Cobra, come out in favor of a proof-of-work change and has been voicing concerns about Bitmain controlling ownership over 3 of the main Bitcoin mining pools. And the quote here is, as of the last writing, at least 53% more likely of the hash rate is controlled by. And they mentioned 3 different pools. This is a dangerous level of centralization. Is this a real concern threat to Bitcoin? And does something like a proof of work change really address the core issue of mining centralization and control? Or would it only delay the inevitable? What other options would be available for Bitcoin to combat hidden pool ownership by large actors such as Bitmain, if such ownership is in fact legitimate? There are good examples of other communities trying to combat ASICs in recent times. So I would like to know why Bitcoin itself could not respond in a similar way. An example below. And it goes on to, you can read the question yourselves, but it goes on to talk about a recent change in the way Monero does its proof-of-work algorithm in response to the release of ASICs. So I disagree. I think a proof-of-work change doesn't combat mining centralization. In fact, it's likely to make it worse. You see, the thing about proof-of-work at the moment is that the centralization is driven by economic factors that have a lot to do with how quickly Bitcoin went from being CPU mined to being GPU, FPGA, and finally ASIC mined over a period of about 9 years. This meant that the hardware was being obsoleted very, very quickly, which gave enormous advantage to those who had close proximity to silicon fabrication plants and cheap electricity. And that's 99% was concentrated in particular regions of China. But those incentives and that economic structure is pretty much over. And the reason for that is that as ASICs achieved the highest level of silicon density, at about 16 nanometers and now moving towards 12 nanometers of silicon fabrication, there is no more 1000x performance improvement available in the next level of silicon fabrication density. We've already hit the wall. Moore's law applies. And now you can get maybe a 2x improvement in performance over the next 18 months. And even that's doubtful because at these levels of densities, we're reaching kind of the end of Moore's law in the traditional sense of chip density. And so what does that mean? That means that this silicon, these ASICs, this equipment, when manufactured, now has a shelf life that is more than 2 years, not just 2 months. And that means that it can be deployed in many other places where there are a set of favorable conditions, which include both cheap electricity, low operating costs, but also several other considerations, such as political considerations. In fact, the concentration of mining in China is a disadvantage for Chinese miners too, because having too much mining in one place makes you susceptible to political coercion and extortion. It also increases the risks from natural disasters, electricity shortages, a fire in one of the warehouses, or some other situation like that. So I expect we will see that the centralization of mining is already reversing itself. It's going to take several years until that plays out, but we're beginning to see the emergence of other manufacturers making ASICs, and other locations vying and competing for this. Now, let's play the other side of the game, which is what happens if you did a change in the proof of work. First of all, that would devastate the security of the Bitcoin network. And maybe you can do it on a smaller network like Monero, but quite honestly, Bitcoin security is the most robust level of security that exists at the moment. And a change in the proof of work would basically reset that. And all of the investment in ASICs would be wiped out. But that also means all of the existing security investment in Bitcoin would be wiped out. And we're talking about several $billion of industrial scale infrastructure that secures Bitcoin against various forms of attack. And so that's not a good thing. And it's a very, I think, cavalier suggestion to simply change proof of work. Also, I don't think it would be effective. I think an attempt to change Bitcoin's proof of work would be a contentious fork that would not have majority consensus, and as a result, would result in a fork of Bitcoin, a contentious fork that would split Bitcoin into Bitcoin SHA-256 and Bitcoin something else. And the Bitcoin something else would have a very hard time rebooting its security. Also, who do you think would reboot that security faster? So let's say the proof of work algorithm is changed, maybe made a bit more ASIC resistant. Well, theoretically, the very same players who have a couple $1 billion of liquid cash available to them, all of the operating expertise, manufacturing pipelines, relationships with silicon fabrication, and access to inexpensive electricity, you think they might have an advantage in rebooting their entire operation and investing in the new proof of work algorithm? Arguably, they would gain an even bigger share of the new proof of work algorithm mining and manufacturing facility, because it would set back everybody. Only they would have the advantage of 8 years of experience, $2 billion, and existing relationships with manufacturers. So I think it would actually undo the effects of competition that we're already seeing taking hold in this space. So no to a proof of work algorithm change, no to shooting Bitcoin in the foot in order to really deal with a threat of centralization that I think is already waning, and no to giving more power to developers or other parties who make unilateral decisions about proof of work algorithm and split the consensus of the network. Okay, let me take a sip here and see where we are. All right, lots of questions coming up on the chat room. We'll take that discussion offline in a bit. Jesse asks, on the Lightning Network, what prevents a bad actor from using the revocation transaction to steal coins? Jesse says, I've been trying to understand the game theory of the commitment transactions and revocation transactions in the Lightning Network, but I don't see why someone couldn't proactively use the revocation transaction to steal coins. Can you explain how the revocation key is only revealed if a commitment transaction is broadcast maliciously? What prevents a malicious Lightning node from intentionally dropping off the network, prompting an honest node to publish the last commitment transaction, and then popping back on to publish the revocation key and steal all the coins in the channel? Right, great. Let's talk about this. It's a bit complicated, I'm going to warn you, but first of all, there is no such thing as a revocation transaction. There are only commitment transactions. And commitment transactions are complex transactions which have multiple different spending branches, meaning that there are different conditions on which you can spend a commitment transaction. That's first thing you have to understand. there are revocation keys. And the revocation keys are exchanged between the two parties in the Lightning connection after they sign the next commitment transaction. And in order to invalidate the previous commitment transaction, essentially to revoke the prior state now that there's new state, and to ensure that the prior state cannot be unilaterally transmitted by one of the two parties. And here's the really important thing. It's not like there's one commitment transaction. There are always two commitment transactions, and these commitment transactions are asymmetric bilaterally. What that means is, let's say I'm Bob, and I have a channel with Alice. I have a commitment transaction signed by Alice, and Alice has a commitment transaction signed by me. And we have these on standby where we can countersign them, transmit them to the network, and activate them effectively. But the commitment transaction I'm holding, which has Alice's signature, is different from the commitment transaction Alice holds that has my signature. And the reason it's different is because the commitment transaction that I have that has Alice's signature on it pays Alice first and then delays the payment to me. And that's really, really important. Meanwhile, the other transaction that Alice holds that I have signed pays me first and pays Alice with a delay. So the payment to Alice has a time lock on it, whereas the payment to me is instant. I can claim it as soon as that transaction is broadcast. So I have a transaction. It's signed by Alice. It pays Alice immediately, but it only has a time lock on the payment that goes to me. If I choose to countersign that and broadcast that transaction, I'm creating both of those outputs on the network, but Alice's output can be claimed immediately, and my output is delayed. There's another output that can be claimed by Alice, but that requires the revocation key, and that one consumes all of the channel balance, and that's my punishment output, if you like. And once I've given the revocation key to Alice, if I transmit the commitment transaction, then Alice can take that one output and claim the entire channel balance with the revocation key. Meanwhile, I can't, because my output is still time locked. So there's this fundamental interplay where my payment is delayed by a bit, but I've given the ammunition to Alice to burn the payment completely if I try to cheat, and she can execute that immediately, whereas I have to wait. And by the time I'm done waiting, she's already executed, claimed that output, and there's nothing for me to claim. So Alice has a head start on the transaction I'm holding and can always claim it before I can. Meanwhile, I have a head start on the transaction I signed that she's holding, and she has to wait on that one. So we're always at a slight disadvantage on the transactions we hold that we can transmit unilaterally, but we're on an equal footing on the transaction the other person holds, which we can close cooperatively. That's the subtle balance in game theory in the Lightning Network. Peter asks, actually, let me check the chat room. 1 second, sorry. I just got a funny message on the chat room from Daniel, who apparently pushed the button on his YubiKey and dumped a whole bunch of characters in the chat room. So I'm going to hide that one. That's a funny one. Hey, Daniel. Peter asks, resolving inconsistencies in your stance on privacy. Peter says, sometimes you say that Bitcoin is good because it achieves privacy, or at least future implementations will achieve full financial privacy. I've also heard you dismiss the pedo-Nazis' argument against Bitcoin by pointing out that blockchains actually help trace back transactions once you have a suspect's IP address or Bitcoin address. These propositions are not really compatible. Could you be more specific about the level of privacy you would like to see in Bitcoin? Thank you, Peter, for this opportunity. First of all, let me disclaim this fanciful idea that all of my thoughts, opinions, and ideas are 100% internally consistent and provable true. I will use the Gödel defense and say that either my statements are incomplete or they're inconsistent, but they can never be both complete and consistent because that would violate Gödel's theorem. So let me try and be more specific. I think the fundamental difference here is a matter of scale. You see, I believe that we should have privacy in Bitcoin that allows every individual to maintain their financial privacy against broad-based, blanket, indiscriminate surveillance by central parties. So broad-based, blanket, warrantless, unconstitutional, in violation of the Human Rights Charter and broadly accepted human rights. That kind of unconstitutional, illegal, immoral surveillance that violates human rights should be impossible to do in Bitcoin. On the other hand, if someone is doing something that involves criminal activity, it's not going to be broad-based surveillance that catches them. That's a fallacy, and it's a fallacy that's being sold to us primarily to persuade us that as long as we give a little more power and give up a little more privacy, crime will finally be beaten, terrorism will end, pedophiles will no longer exist, abuse of children will stop, all of the bad things will go away. All you have to do is trust a few people in power to have ultimate control over your privacy, your life, your human rights, and everything else, and everything will be okay. That authoritarian lie is basically designed to give more and more and more power. And in the end, it doesn't make the world a better place. Arguably, it makes the world a terrifying fascist autocracy. So what do you do about crime? And the truth is that the vast majority of crime is solved by investigation and primarily by human factors. So the person who's committing these crimes, who's abusing children or committing fraud or stealing money or extorting people or holding people to ransom or whatever else you might be thinking of as one of the horrible things that will be committed on blockchains with money, just like they're committed with every other currency in the world. Most of the time, there's going to be a trail of evidence. It's going to be on their computer. It's going to be evidence that their co-conspirators know about. And I think law enforcement has traditional tools that they can use. In the case of a crime where there is probable cause, where you can get a magistrate to sign a probable cause warrant, and a person can be investigated and their privacy stripped under due process of law, then that evidence will be sitting right there on their computer. And not only will they leave a trail, and their co-conspirators will know about this and can be flipped, and all of the other traditional law enforcement techniques, but also once you have their computer, their private keys, and various other things that you got through due process and a properly signed warrant, well, now you have forensic evidence on the blockchain that they committed a crime. So my stance of privacy is simple. I am against blanket, indiscriminate, warrantless, unconstitutional surveillance that violates human rights and gives enormous power to centralized actors who will abuse that power and ultimately erode and then destroy democracy. I don't believe that criminals should have privacy, but in order to strip someone of privacy and declare them a criminal, you need due process of law and you need a warrant. And the idea of stripping everyone of privacy in order to protect against crime means that in the end, only criminals will have privacy because they'll simply break the law that requires them to use the currency that's under surveillance. None of us will have privacy except the criminals. And crime will never go away because crime has nothing to do with the currency you use or the computer technology or the tool. It's a fundamental part of human nature. So claim your privacy. There's a difference between indiscriminate, broad-based, warrantless surveillance and the appropriate application of justice through due process and properly signed warrants and the protections we have under all of the human rights charters in every civilized place on Earth. Eric asks, LAPS and atomic swaps. I'm excited about the release of the first new LAPS. LAPS, by the way, stands for Lightning Apps, LAPS. However, I didn't see anything about atomic swaps on Lightning. Do you foresee the possibility altcoins without SegWit integrating with the Lightning ecosystem with a LAP? Eric, it's not the issue of whether altcoins have or don't have SegWit. SegWit isn't necessary for Lightning to operate. It's more about whether these other chains have a fix for transaction malleability. If a chain has a fix for transaction malleability, if it doesn't suffer from a transaction malleability, and that fix could be SegWit, it could be flexible transactions, it could be 100 other schemes that could be used to change transaction malleability. If a chain does not have a transaction malleability problem, and it has the basic capabilities of simple smart contracts, specifically multi-signature, hash time locks, in its capability, then you can absolutely implement Lightning. In fact, you can implement Lightning that's compatible with the Bolt standard, which would then allow you to do multi-currency Lightning between that chain and Bitcoin and Litecoin. The reason you don't see atomic swaps is because right now, this is very, very early days in Lightning, and you won't see a LAP implementing atomic swaps, I don't think, anytime soon. And if you do, you're going to see it on Litecoin and Bitcoin only. And that's because really the only client, I believe, that supports multiple chains is LND, the Lightning Network daemon from Lightning Labs. And that, for the time being, supports Bitcoin and Litecoin, no other chains at the moment. And so we might see a LAP that implements atomic swaps between Bitcoin and Litecoin. You don't need Lightning to do atomic swaps. You can do them using simpler technology, and we've seen that demonstrated by a number of different chains. I believe the first one to do it was Komodo. But if people port the Lightning software or implement their own Lightning software using the Bolt specifications to their blockchain, then eventually we will be able to see multi-currency Lightning running across multiple blockchains. And I expect that someone's going to build an easy-to-use LAP that allows you to do currency conversion in a decentralized manner over Lightning. It's just going to take time. Lysander asks, what is the optimal time to come out openly as a Bitcoin user? How do you arbitrage between, one, talking openly about Bitcoin when transacting, thereby drawing attention from the tax administration, regulators, thieves, jealous people who see you as a millionaire, etc., and two, quietly running your Bitcoin operations as discreetly as possible? The former may help network adoption at the risk of deciding the government to strike hard against it. The latter may seem selfish, but it might be more efficient to let the network grow naturally, which it should. Good things barely need active promotion, and stay under government radar until it is too big to be destroyed. That's a great question, Lysander. First of all, I agree with the final part of your statement, which is good things barely need active promotion. If people need Bitcoin, they're going to figure it out. They're going to find it, and they're going to use it. And the vast majority of people who got all excited about Bitcoin in 2013 and then again in 2017 did not get excited because they needed Bitcoin or any of the other ICOs and tokens that gains a lot of attention. It was mostly speculative attention, and that doesn't help. I don't think it helps the industry develop. I think it distracts. I think it creates a lot of noise and potentially backlash. When is the optimal time to come out openly as a Bitcoin user? Never. Bitcoin what? Who? No, I don't. Is that a game token? I've never heard of it. Are you a computer geek? I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have the option to do that. And trust me, it comes at a very heavy personal price and with a lot of risks. So if people don't know that you're involved in Bitcoin, if you haven't already made the mistake of publicly declaring how much you're involved in Bitcoin, and I think out of enthusiasm, a lot of us did in the early days, then shut up. Keep it to yourself. You're going to be safer. Your family is going to be safer. You don't need to be the ambassador and advocate for Bitcoin's promotion to the world. Some of us don't have that option anymore. And it's not an easy thing to do. I don't regret being public and talking about this technology. I've always been very enthusiastic about this technology. But at the same time, having that kind of public knowledge makes things difficult for me. So I would say keep your mouth shut. All right. Final question for today is from user Silver. Hardware wallet versus Glacier protocol. Do you think the Glacier protocol is a good alternative to a hardware wallet? Silver says, Glacier protocol is a step-by-step protocol for storing Bitcoin in a highly secure manner, but it has not been widely tested by the global community. Would you recommend similar processes in addition to storing your key on a hardware wallet? I don't recommend that. And the reason I don't recommend that is because while the Glacier protocol is an interesting approach and it's a detailed and step-by-step instruction on how to build what is known as an air-gapped, offline, quarantined, or call it whatever you want, a machine that hasn't touched the internet and never touches the internet. This is the kind of technical document that requires a lot of expertise in command line and operating systems, and it's very easy to do it wrong. And if you do it wrong, then you've exposed yourself to a number of risks, which can then lead to your funds being compromised. I think for the vast majority of users, and what I mean by that is all but maybe a few thousand people who are involved out of the 25 million people who own cryptocurrency, maybe 2,000-3,000 people can actually implement something like Glacier protocol effectively and securely without messing it up, and actually know what they're doing and do it securely. For the vast majority of people, it's way too complex. And a hardware wallet may not be as secure as a perfectly executed implementation of Glacier is, but maybe it's 95% as secure, and yet it is far easier to do and to do effectively. So in security, it really matters how usable a security mechanism is. From an operational perspective, whether you can execute the security required, execute it correctly, and operate it. There's a few other considerations as well. One of the critical considerations is how do you ensure that your heirs or dependents can access your funds if something happens to you. And again, the more complex and custom and esoteric the technique you use, the harder it's going to be for anyone to figure out what you did and help your heirs access your funds. So generally speaking, while I think Glacier Protocol is interesting and I can implement Glacier Protocol, in fact, I have built air-gapped computers, and I did build air-gapped computers as a security professional for years back in the 90s. It's hard to build an air-gapped computer correctly. Nowadays, we know that a lot of the hardware that's in your average laptop has a ton of vulnerabilities. And we also know of all kinds of exfiltration techniques that can be used on laptops, including ultrasound and things like that. So to really, really build a properly air-gapped computer, you have to go in there and quite heavily modify the hardware, or at least strip out a lot of devices, including microphones, speakers, infrared receivers, Bluetooth connections, wireless connections, wired connections, glue shut the USB ports and all of that stuff. And if you can do that, maybe you can build an air-gapped computer. For the vast majority of people, that's what a hardware wallet is. And even despite you might hear vulnerabilities being discovered, it's actually quite difficult to exploit those vulnerabilities without physical access to hardware. And it's still far, far easier for the vast majority of people to implement, and less expensive to implement, a hardware wallet. So I recommend a hardware wallet. If you want to try and play with something like Glacier Protocol, be my guest. At the very least, it's a great learning opportunity. You're going to learn a lot about security, about Unix command line, about playing with hardware and building operating systems securely. Great learning opportunity. But for the vast majority of users, it's not really relevant. OK, let me quickly check in the chat room, but I think that covers all of the questions we had. Excellent. Once again, thank you for all of the great questions. Thank you for asking. Thank you for commenting. Thank you for voting to help me pick which questions I would answer today. Most of all, thank you so much for being a Patreon supporter. I know that, especially at the moment with cryptocurrency prices declining quite rapidly, many of you are probably wondering, do I really want to still keep doing this? Can I afford to do this? So I want to let you know that it means a lot to me. It gives me the independence and the peace of mind and the financial security to be able to continue to do this job without corporate sponsors, without chasing corporate gigs, and be able to do it truly for the people who are my audience, my community, and that's you. So every time you contribute through Patreon, be it $2 a month or $5 a month or whatever you can afford, it makes a huge difference, and it allows me to do this. I'm very, very grateful that you're sticking with me and weathering this temporary setback, I think. And let's continue doing good work and bringing as much education and quality information to as many people around the world as possible in as many languages. I'll be giving you a great update on some of the strategic initiatives. We've got a lot of translations going on the YouTube videos, a lot of translations on the books, donations of books to universities and other libraries for free. And so all of that is made possible because of your support on Patreon. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing that. I will see you all in 1 month when we're going to do our April Q&A. Dates to be announced soon, and the Q&A will be public at the end of next week, so you can start asking your great questions. That's all for now. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye, everyone.